For those of you who've just joined us in the last few minutes, welcome. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded for anybody who may have had coworkers unable to attend live, and we'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel later this week. Everybody will be muted by default during the presentation to kind of keep some of that background noise down, and then we'll have some time for questions throughout the webinar where I'll go ahead and unmute it. That being said, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best to kind of address those as we can towards the end. So with that, I will pass it over to our speaker today, Tony.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I hope this presentation gives you some interest and at least generate some questions. It's a new process that NERC's starting, and I think it's going to change our world a little bit. So my name is Tony Hall. I'm a principal consultant here at GridU. I've spent several years at vertical integrated utility, and the last 15 or so years in the compliance world, and the time before that, I'm kind of an IT cybersecurity person. So next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about the NERC standards development process. We're going to talk about the current process and the timing with that, some of the issues that's come up with that. Because of those issues, we're going to talk about process that was started a year ago called the Modernization of Standards, Process, and Procedures that NERC created a task force for. Some of the timing of that new process, and hopefully you guys have some questions. Next slide, please. So this may be a little bit of a busy slide, but this is the current drafting process. So I'm not sure how many of you guys are aware of this, but this is how NERC develops their processes for standard development. So the current process flow starts with initiation of a need. So that is a SAR, Standard Authorization Request. This can actually be submitted by anyone. It can be submitted by CERC, or it can be submitted by NERC. Any of the regions, it can be submitted by an industry subgroup. It can actually be submitted by an individual if they feel like there's a need to change in some of the standards. The submissions by individuals don't happen a lot, but that is a process that can occur. As the SAR gets submitted, it goes through an approval process. Currently today with the Standards Committee, it goes through that approval process, and that Standards Committee uses that process to prioritize any of that work. Once that SAR gets prioritized, a SAR drafting team gets created. That SAR drafting team then looks at the SAR, makes changes to it that they may find necessary, and puts that out for comment by industry. Once it goes out to comment by industry, industry has the ability to comment on whether the SAR is needed, technical questions about the SAR, and then that SAR gets adjusted based on those comments and gets sent back to the drafting standards committee to get the final approval. The important part about the SAR is that is the drafting team's guide and objectives for that process. So things they can and can't do when they're changing a standard are all contained within that SAR. So it actually puts a framework around the drafting team process. Then once that SAR is approved, typically the SAR drafting team gets promoted to the exact standard drafting team. That doesn't always have to occur that way. If you want to be on the SAR drafting team today, you could be just on that and not participate fully in the drafting team process, or you can join the drafting team after the SAR gets approved. So typically that happens and the drafting team gets set. One of the things that's interesting, and one of the issues that are goes along with this, is the timing that it takes to get through initiation to actually start drafting. And we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But as that goes, the drafting team will then make changes to a standard, or they could create an additional standard. They'll work on that for a while. It'll get sent out to industry for comments and revisions. Industry votes on it. They make comments. The drafting team will take those comments and make revisions. Those comment periods typically last 45 days. They can be shortened with standards committee approval to as little as 20 days, but typically it's 45 days. And then that iteration goes around and around until the actual standard gets voted approved. I've not seen very many standards in the past get approved on the first go around. In 2018, I had the privilege of being involved with a standard that got the lowest approval rating ever on its first ballot. That record has since been broken several times since then, with a lot of things have changed. But typically, you don't see a ballot get approved on the first time. So once it goes through the ballot process and gets approved, then it goes on to the NERC Board of Trustees for their approval. And then once it finishes with the NERC Board of Trustees approval, it moves on to FERC. And that approval at FERC can take some time as well. So next slide, please. So what's the issues with the current process? As I mentioned before, the comment things can take a while. Those are usually 45 days. If you think about it and you add that up, it takes a bit of time to select a drafting team, seat that drafting team, because that requires standards committee approval. So that can take 45 to 60 days to go through that. If you have a time where it takes a drafting team to create a draft, say it takes them a couple of months, so that's another 60 days, and 45 days for comments. You're looking at 6 months, maybe, before a process gets out or a standard gets out to vote for industry. And then if it gets sent back, which they typically do, and then the drafting team has to respond to comments, then they have to make changes to the standard, and then it goes back out again for another comment period. So typically these standards in a good process would take 12 months to 15 months to get done. It could take as long as 18 months to 24 months. Now, all that depends on whether or not this SAR came from a FERC directive. Typically, FERC directives have deadlines that have to be, the standards have to be back to FERC for approval. So when that happens is when the standards committee would change some of those posting deadlines from 45 days to 30 days. And like I said, some of those could be as low as 20 days as you move forward. So that's part of the process that takes it a while. The other part of that is that it takes a while just because a lot of times industry doesn't get involved until the first ballot and commenting process. So a lot of times you will hear about a drafting team getting put together. You may not really know a lot about it. All drafting team meetings are open to the public, so anyone could join those. But a lot of times they don't join or do anything until the ballot comes out the first time. So a lot of times that's industry's first time at seeing what the words look like. So a lot of times they'll typically vote no just to get their comments heard and move things forward that way, and in the process of making changes. One of the reasons that the current process has created some problems is technology. Technology is advancing very quickly. When you talk about the CIP or the cybersecurity standards, changes in cyber happen daily. So having requirements and standards in place that can't meet new technologies creates problems for people to be able to move. On the SIP side of things, one of the issues now is the use of cloud technologies. Technically, the way the standards are written today on the SIP side, you can't really use cloud applications as part of meeting those requirements. But now we have vendors who are only offering applications in the cloud environment. So those standards have to change to be able to do that. And the slow timing of making those changes is a little bit of a problem. And I think the same thing is going to happen with our Category 2 generation assets. Right now, there's a few standards that are applicable to those assets, but with the technology and items moving so fast in the inverter world, the Cat 2 world, the ability to move forward quickly on those standards and make changes to help industry use technology that's available, and then to help NERC and regions and FERC understand the requirements associated with the technology becomes very important. I will just throw an example out here. There was a SIP drafting team that was started in 2016 to use virtualization in the cyber world. That standard drafting team worked for approximately 8 years And then they submitted their stuff to FERC, and FERC took almost 18 months to approve it. So that particular set of standards wasn't approved until February of 2026. So that type of process is where NERC feels like things need to move much quicker. So with that, I'll ask if there's any questions on the current process that people would like to ask. If not, we will move right on to the proposed process. And I don't see anything in the chat. So if there's no question, we'll move forward to the next slide, please. So I broke this down into three separate swim lanes because sorry, I think I got muted when we remuted everyone. So I broke this down into three slides. So there's basically three sets of processes for this new development process. There's the initiation of the request, there's the drafting of the request, and there's the balloting of the request. So when this task force got put together, they broke this down into those three pieces to see if there were places where they could make vast improvements. So the task force got put together by NERC last year, January 2025, December 2024 timeframe, and they were told to look at the drafting process and not just look at are there changes we can make to the current process, but if there are things that are broken, fill those processes out and start all over. So they basically had a clean slate of what they wanted to do to create these new processes. So they really took that initiative to heart, and they really looked at making a complete overhaul of this process. So I've broken it down into three things, and I will put in the chat links to the NERC pages for this process team and what they did, so you can look at all the historical documents for that as we go forward. In fact, I'll do that here real quickly while I'm talking. And then we'll go on from there. So the initiation process. So again, anyone can initiate a SAR, or what we call a standard authorization request. In the new world, this is considered a standard initiation review. So they've kind of changed the name of it a little bit, and it's really just the matter of making things a little different. The biggest things that's coming along with this initiation process, and you can see it over here in the flow, is that if someone submits this SAR request, they're going to take that, NERC's going to take that, and they're going to review those twice a year, and they're going to pass those to a committee that's already in place. This committee is the RSTC, that's Reliability, Security, and Technology Committee. And the reason they're going to do that is they're going to have this RSTC look at the technologically viability of this request. So is this something where technology exists today that this can do? Is there things associated with this that could create a little bit of conflict with what's going on? And they want to get that done up front, because they're thinking if we do this up front, we'll have less to deal with on the back end. The other part that the RSTC is going to do is they're going to solicit informal comments about the SAR early on. So I mentioned the SAR drafting team in the beginning. The RSTC is going to kind of take the place of that SAR drafting team. If they're going to take that SAR, they're going to look at the requirements around it. They're going to look at the technology associated with that, and they're going to start asking for comments from industry early on in the process. So that's one of the big changes. Comments on what's happening with this new standard is going to be moved way, way up in the beginning before a drafting team even gets put in place, right? So once they have done that and they decide that this particular standard request is viable to move forward, they will send this to the the risk committee. So that's the Reliability Issues and Standards Committee. That committee is basically taking place of the Standards Committee today. So the Standards Committee is going to be retired. The Risk Committee is going to take over those processes. So they're going to look at that standard that comes from the RSTC, and they're going to look at a process to start the drafting process of that, right? They're going to approve it, they're going to prioritize it, and they're going to move that stuff forward and send it to the drafting process. So that's kind of the beginning of the standard. So it sounds like this is adding a lot to the standard authorization request, beginning of that. But the goal here is to get a lot of industry comments in the beginning in this initiation process. So as you get through the drafting and the balloting process, those become shorter and you deal with things more upfront with these two, the RSTC and the risk committee. Next slide, please. So this next slide is the drafting process. And this is where another big change is occurring. So if you notice, the swim lanes talk about NERC is added into the swim lane. So once the RSTC has decided that this particular request is viable and the risk subcommittee has prioritized it and moved it forward, then NERC is going to prepare what they're calling version 0 of this draft standard. So NERC is going to actually take the standard authorization request. They're going to draft language to start off with, a version 0. And NERC's actually looking at tools and building an AI large language model to try to help draft this version 0 of the standard. And then this version 0 is going to be passed back to the risk committee. And this risk committee, one of the new tasks they're going to get is they're going to create what they're calling an SME pool of members. Okay, this SME pool is going to be made up of engineers, cyber security experts, compliance folks. So you think about a drafting team pool of several hundred people that's going to sit there and be ready to go at any point in time. So instead of going out and soliciting drafting team members, they're going to create this SME pool that's basically going to be the drafting team pool as they go forward. So all drafting team members will be pulled from this SME pool. They're going to have processes in place that are still to come on how this SME pool gets created and how it gets maintained, how people stay on it. You know, one of the concerns that NERC has today is that they will put together a drafting team and there'll be members of that drafting team that aren't as involved as they may need to be for moving that process forward. So they're going to do things like track who in this SME pool is raising their hand to work on new standards as they come forward. And if you're on that pool and you're not participating at all, you may be dropped and they will replace you with another member. So as NERC creates that version 0, it gets passed to this SME drafting team pool. The people on that pool who have the expertise to work on this particular standard. So if it's a SIP standard, you know, there will be some cyber people who will raise their hand, compliance people will raise their hand. If it's an engineering standard, then you'll have maybe protection engineers or other engineers raise their hand. And they will take that standard and they will make informal comments back to NERC about it, and they will look at the viability of that standard and make some adjustments to it. And then that SME project team will conduct informal feedback on that. So they'll reach out to industry groups. They will put stuff out for comment on these things. So this is the second time where a standard now will get informal comment as it's going through the process. So it happened once at the initiation process. Now there's words on the standard, so it's happening again as the words get put on the standard. And this project team will take that informal commenting and they will make revisions to the standards based on those informal comments. Okay. Once they come back, if there's comments or concerns that come back, they could always push that up to NERC or they could push that back to the RSTC to do a technical review. So they can always use any of these groups and these swim teams to make any changes as they seem needed or necessary. So once that happens, the project team moves it through that commenting period, again, very quickly. So probably not 45 days like it's been done in the past. And if you'll notice on this slide deck, there's a little bit of thing there, red words there. It talks about fast tracking, where the timing may be compressed. This will be used if there's a FERC directive that says, hey, you know, get this back to us in 18 months or 12 months. So there's a fast track process with that. So as that project team continues to review comments and make changes with the stakeholders, that will all get added to the standard, and this is all being done in a compressed time frame. So next slide, please. And that puts us in the last piece of the process, which is the balloting process. So there's some changes here that is of note that needs to be, everybody needs to be aware of. So if you'll remember, I talked about informal commenting during the initiation process, informal commenting during the drafting process. So there's an assumption here that all of that hard work that's being done in the initiation process by the RSTC, in the drafting process by the project team, will all pay off when it comes to the balloting process, and that all the concerns and all that kind of stuff will all have been taken care of during those informal commenting periods early on. So if you get to the balloting process and you see something, incredibly wrong, or you're just now coming into it, chances are that those comments have been addressed, and they may have been decided to not use those comments or move forward with what's being done today. So the project team will put together a balloting package for this. It'll go out to ballot. So in ballot, it'll include the same things that we have today. You'll see the red line standards. You'll see an implementation plan. You'll see a technical rationale. You'll see summary of the comments that's happened through the informal processes between the initiation and the drafting part. So you'll see the same type of things that have occurred previously in the balloting process. I guess the biggest difference here is that they're asking for you to be a member of the registered ballot body early on in this process. So one of the things that the task force came out with is that the ballot body needs some work, and NERC is still working on what that means for the ballot body. Typically, the way this works today is that you join the ballot body during the first balloting process, and then you're in it to go along. You're going to be joining the balloting body now, either in the initiation or in the drafting process. So if you've not joined the ballot body in the initiation process or the or the drafting process, you will not be able to join it in the balloting process. So you have to really be aware, and NERC's pushing the timeline of industry awareness way early in the process. So as it goes out for balloting, like I said, the assumption is that all of the things have gotten worked out in the initiation and the drafting process. So they're expecting a lot more confirmation ballots in the beginning. So that means a yes vote. So they're expecting a lot of that. So if it passes, it goes to the board, follows the normal process that goes to FERC. If it doesn't pass ballot the first time, it goes back to the risk committee, and they decide whether or not that it deserves what they're calling an extraordinary ballot, which is a second ballot, or if it just falls into this alternative action. So there's two issues here. So if it falls into the extraordinary ballot process, the project team that was working on it will make some changes, and then they'll post it back out for a second ballot. Hopefully it'll get approval then, and it'll come back and it'll pass. If this risk committee decides that it doesn't fall into this extraordinary ballot process, it ends that work and it sends it to the alternative action process, where it goes back to the RSTC to say, here's what's come out, here's some additional comments. Technically, does this draft standard that's been written during the drafting process match the technical requirements from the initiation process? And if it does, and they agree, that it gets sent to the board for action, and then the board can decide whether or not to approve it and send it on the FERC or not. So it's a little different in that process, in that it could very easily not pass ballot, but be considered technically viable by the RSTC and then move forward in the approval process. So next slide, please. So what still has to happen in the NERC process to get this going? So obviously, the NERC rules and procedures are written out today to follow the process we talked about early on. So the beginning process, the rules and procedures are going to have to be changed. There's going to have to be voting on the rules and procedure change. So there is an opportunity still for industry to make comments on this process as they make the actual formal legal changes in the rules and procedures. So that process is still to come. They still have to create the risk subcommittee that's going to accommodate and take on the work of the standards committee. They have to go out and solicit this SME pool and get those people placed. The RSTC has to create processes for their technical justification rule and how that's going to go forward and how they're going to handle that process. So all of those things still have to occur. NERC is working on that today. I will say that they are planning to pilot this process with the large load, or what they're calling the computational load standards development. So the large loads or data center loads or computational loads that they're calling it are going to follow this process as I've shown you in the previous slides as a pilot as they're working on these rules of procedure changes. So next slide, please. And this is the, what does all this mean to us? So this may be the one that generates some questions. So streamlined drafting process. As you can see through the other stuff, they're really trying to front load the process and get all the comments, get industry input up early. So really the balloting becomes kind of a formal check the box type process. So everything that gets done very early in the development process. I think there's still some questions on how that's really going to work if it comes directly from a FERC order, like FERC Order 901 was done with all the IBR things, and how much input the RSTC is going to have on those changes. So if there's a FERC order, I suspect those will move through that RSTC risk committee processes very quickly because it's pretty much defined in the FERC order what needs to occur. The SAR will be drafted in order to put those project boundaries around the drafting team part of the process to make sure that the drafting team's actually meeting the requirements of the SAR of the FERC order. So that kind of stuff will happen very quickly. Early industry involvement. I mean, commenting on the SAR with the RSTC. I'm not sure how many people attend RSTC meetings. They meet quarterly in person, monthly on a regular basis. There's a lot of good information that comes out on that. All of those committees are on the NERC website, so you can find that. So if you've never listened into one of those meetings, they go through a lot of things. They have a lot of standing committees inside of the RSTC that meet outside of those normal RSTC meetings. So those are places where you can get a lot of information about what's going on. Even going forward with the drafting teams, those meetings will be public. So as that SME project team pool is talking about changes to the standards, all of that stuff is public. So listening into those meetings, understanding the basis behind what the words on the page are is a good time to get involved. You know, early involvement. That's this whole part about commenting on draft zero. I think that's going to be very important. I will say, as I've been a member of several drafting teams, and a lot of times just getting words on paper is a very difficult part of the drafting team process. It's not as hard if you are modifying a current standard to make changes to that as it is as you're creating a whole brand new standard. That putting those first straw men together, it's a lot easier to throw darts at straw men than it is to come up with new words for draft zero. So the other part of this is new standards being able to keep up with technology. I mentioned cloud technology, you know, inverter technology is changing. You know, when you think about a standard that takes a team 12 months to 18 months to draft, a lot of times they will have 12-month to 18-month implementation plans. So you're talking about 3 years of, you know, an issue coming up and the standard being effective. A lot can change in 3 years from a technology perspective. So things that, you know, standards or requirements that look really good today may not look so good, you know, 18 months, 24 months from now when technology has changed and people are trying to implement that technology that's associated with the words that are on that drafting page and the requirements. So I think it's very important that these things move a little faster. The downside of those things moving faster is that we have new standards that we have to address. So that just means things have to address much faster. So things get moving faster. We have to address things faster. I will give an example of this addressing things faster. There was two drafting teams working on changes to SIP3. And as you guys are aware, most of our clients, just went to SIP3 version 9. It was effective April 1st. And in February, because there were two drafting teams that were working on changing to SIP3 simultaneously, one got submitted to FERC ahead of time. We had a new administration. Things kind of got a little wonky with the administration and things weren't getting approved as quickly. And then another one came shortly thereafter. In February, FERC approved SIP3 version 10 and SIP3 version 11. So while we just have version 9, there are now two different versions of SIP3 that have changed. And some of that has to do with the way the process works today and how long it took the -10 team to get done with their work, and the -11 team got done with their work faster than anticipated. So things kind of got clogged in the pipeline for there. So I think it's very important that we move that stuff forward. It's also very important for industry to be able to keep up with the technology changes. Like I said, having new technology at your fingertips, wanting to, install that new inverter change or install a new cybersecurity technology, and the NERC standards telling you there's no way to meet the requirements if you do this, is just not good for industry. It's not good for business. So I think that's very important. And then the last bullet, I think, is the whole point and the rules of procedures about Section 321. So in the rules of procedures, Section 321 allows NERC to bypass the vote of industry. So industry could vote down a standard, and say, 10% says it's good and 90% says don't do this. But NERC has the ability to take that standard, take it to the Board of Trustees anyway, and say, we believe the words that are written here are appropriate to meet whatever requirements are there. And we're putting it, even though industry voted no for, we're putting it to the Board of Trustees to vote yes, and then send that on to FERC for approval. In the last, 12 years, that really hadn't been used until the cold weather standard EOP, I think -2 was the one, maybe it was -2 that actually pulled this out and used this procedure to do that. So they basically pulled a few members of the drafting team together along with the standards committee. They looked at the last comments on the no vote for that standard. They made a few changes to the standard, sent it to the Board of Trustees, sent it to FERC, and got approved without industry approval. So NERC hadn't used Section 321 for several years. It's been used, I guess, twice in the last 2 years. So this whole process is to get industry buy-in, make sure everybody understands what's changing, do it very, very early on in the process, and then not really force NERC's hand on using Section 321 to push things through that industry really just does not want to move forward. So this moved a little faster than I thought, since I didn't have questions in the beginning. So next slide. So now we're opening it up to all questions. So Terry, I see you raise your hand. What's your question?
Hey, Tony, great job. Great presentation. Nice summary. I think you did a great job of explaining things. I'm concerned with the front loading, the speed, and the informal comments at the RSTC, that's going to really reduce our chances to catch critical flaws. And, like you said, they're hoping that this has minimal no votes towards the end. So do you have concerns along those lines? I know what they're trying to do, but I'm afraid they're setting up a process where we'll actually get a fair number of no votes towards the end. Thanks, Tony.
So I think you're right, Terry. I think the informal comments with the RSTC is really focused around technical viability. Is this standard really something we can do, right? So they want to understand that. And I keep in mind, there's no words on the paper yet as opposed as, as the standard requirement. So it's really just the overall general, hey, is this really an issue that needs to have a SAR, and is it technically viable? So that's the first part of that. I think the second part of that in the drafting process is version 0 and the informal comment with the SME pool. So the hope there is that this SME pool will help point out fatal flaws and things like that in that second round of informal comment once you start seeing words on the page. So I think, Terry, you're right. Having words on the page is where you really kind of see things from an informal, technical flaw type thing. So I think that's got to occur there versus people waiting at the final comment and ballot period. Now, I can tell you that I've been on several drafting teams, and we've held industry outreach, talked to EEI, the trade groups, uh, and through and made changes and thought we addressed a lot of comments. And we go out for ballot the first time, we get a lot of comments, and we try to make adjustments. And what will happen is you will get the same set of comments from the second ballot process that you get on the first ballot process, even when you change the language. So I think the idea here is to get industry involved very early on to help create the issue that you have with ballot comment 1, where you get a set of comments, you make changes. Ballot comment 2, you get a set of comments on changes you just made and trying to make it go back. So you get early involvement and people understand, as you get from point A to point B without having to stop in between. I hope that answers your question. Michael.
It does. I understand that they sort of want to eliminate the back and forth, Tony. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Michael.
Hey, Tony, great job. In the past, there have been O&P standards that had fatal flaws as a result of not proper representation early in the process on the drafting team. There was a mod standard years ago that got approved as a flow-based that didn't work for anybody in the West that was doing contract path. So how does this new process address regional representation for O&P standards to ensure that we don't end up with missing pieces because we don't have the right people involved in the SME pool and other?
So the hope is that this SME pool will solve some of that. I mean, they're looking to have upwards to 125, 130 people in that pool to pull from. The other part that they're hoping to use, and I know this has come up already, and they've used this process and got it approved by FERC early on. The whole abeyance part is that if we get something out that's just not right and industry's doing what they can to meet the requirement, but as you said, Michael, technically it's just not possible, or they've missed something, that there's this abeyance process where industry doesn't get written violations, that fatal flaw gets pushed right back to that process, gets fast tracked into fixing it. And while they're fixing it, you're kind of partial compliance with what's there today. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense yet, but I think that's their hope.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how for the SIP standards, the process may not be as regionally an issue, but specifically in the O&P standards, whether it's in the East where you've got RTOs and places where you don't have RTOs, there's going to be some differences in how a particular standard is written impacts people. And if you don't have that proper distribution of representation, you could end up with some issues. So just something to keep an eye on, I guess.
Yep. And I think, that's actually a valid point with like EOP 12-3. I mean, if you go out there and look, there's an EOP 12 SAR out there now for Canada, because there was not a lot of Canadian representation on EOP 12-3 today, and there's some concerns in Canada on how some of those things apply there because of the weather differences. So I think that's, Michael, that's a great point and something that I think they heard. I don't know how you necessarily keep that many SMEs around. I know today when they're creating a drafting team, they try to get representation from all regions. You know, I was chair of the SIP 3-11 and -9 team. And one of the things that I had concerns on early on is we had a lot of representation on the drafting team from very large utilities and not small ones where SIP 3 really applies. And so we went back out and tried to get some members from low only entities and not people that have high and medium facilities that sometimes low is just an extension of what they're already doing. So I think that's a very important point. And Jill asked in the chat about NERC weighing in on the use of AI to draft requirement language. Jill, is part of their implementation plan, and what's interesting is an FAQ just came out this morning about this process and what the next steps are. And one of the next steps listed in the FAQ was NERC has begun to identify and plan for technology investments for AI tools to assist in the drafting process. So NERC is planning to build some AI models that would allow and help them create version 0 of these standards. I think the theory is that you would take the language model and input the SAR into that with the current version and have it spit out potential updates or changes. And then that's technically the first review by the SME pool before they raise their hand and say, I want to be on the project team to refine this. I think the process is they're expecting that first part of that version 0, that's kind of that goal there. Any other questions, either in the chat or anyone raise your hands? Harry, you raise your hand again.
Hey, Tony. The other thing you mentioned was the RSTC and getting informal comments early. Do you know if NERC plans to highlight when they're going to be soliciting this feedback? I mean, I haven't seen the RSTC meetings published as widely as, we'll just say, like the weekly NERC standards. So I was just curious. That might be a thing that we need to be made aware of. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's probably a great comment as they're going through to create this, right? Because today the RSTC does some work plans and SARs come out of the RSTC, but they haven't had such a critical role in the drafting of standards as much as they will tomorrow. So that would be great input to provide when they're making their changes to the framework and the rules of procedure on doing that and making that more visible. I know it's not, like I said, there's even being on the mailing list for the RSTC, I sometimes miss RSTC mailing notices and things like that. So yeah, that's very important. And I also think it's important for the risk committee too, because the thought process is that they would create a subcommittee of the risk committee today, so this committee could be focused on this standards process. You know, there was a lot of consternation on, well, if you're going to create a subcommittee of the risk, why don't you just keep the standards committee? Not sure the behind the scenes conversation that went on and say retire the standards committee and do this under the risk, but that's where they ended up. You know, the people on the risk committee, I think, are very viable in doing that process. But they also have a lot of other things that are currently on their plate. So this is something new is being added to both of their plates.
Thanks, Tony.
Any other
Great.
questions?
Any last questions here before we wrap up? All right.
And
Well,
I
thank you,
realize this
everybody.
is kind of a high level NERC process. I'm sorry, a high level NERC process and not necessarily the exact standard or requirement. So hopefully that's generated some thought with people.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions come up after the webinar. But we'll wrap up here. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Like I had mentioned before, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tony.